Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Atlanta History Center. I'm Claire Haley, Vice President of Special Projects, and it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you all today and to have the honor of introducing today's distinguished guest. Now, before we do that, just one announcement before we get started. If everyone could take out their cell phone that's probably in your pocket or your purse and make sure that it's on silent or even better, turned off, we would really appreciate that, just to make sure that we have an uninterrupted conversation this afternoon. So before I get started, I just want to say first that this is actually Jack Carr's first ever event in Georgia and in Atlanta. So we are so thrilled that he chose Atlanta History Center. And he is here along with his co-author, James M. Scott, discussing a book that I think when we scheduled this event months ago, we always knew this topic was going to be relevant, but I don't think any of us anticipated just how relevant it was going to be. The book, of course, is Targeted Beirut, the 1983 Marine barracks bombing and the untold origin story of the War on Terror. Now, I see many of you have your books in your hands already this evening or this afternoon. If you don't already have a copy, then I highly encourage you to pick one up on your way out. They are 15% off today. They are pre-signed, and all who purchase a who purchase a book are welcome to join the photo line after the event. So we hope that you'll join us in that. And look, I mean, you need one for yourself, but Christmas is only a few months away, so you can get that off your list today as well. We also have a limited number of Jack's previous books from the back catalog for sale as well, and those are all signed in addition to these tonight. All right, so now to introduce today's authors and moderator. I don't think either of them need very much introduction to this crowd, but just in case. Jack Carr served his country for 20 years as a member of the Navy SEAL teams. He then fulfilled a lifelong dream by becoming an author, and not just any author, but a New York Times bestselling author, starting with his first book, The Terminal List, which of course was turned into an Amazon Prime adaptation starring Chris Pratt. Targeted Beirut actually is his first book of nonfiction, though, and part of a new series, so we're looking forward to seeing what's next in that series. He co-authored the book with historian James M. Scott. James is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a noted historian, as well as a former Nieman Fellow from Harvard. He's the author of several previous books, including Rampage, for which he was a guest actually in our Author Talk series back around 2018. So we're so happy to have James back as well. Jack and James will be in conversation with Zach Knight. Zach is the founder of Advancing the Line for Veterans, an organization dedicated to empowering veterans as they transition from military service to civilian life, particularly in the realm of entrepreneurship and workforce development. And he founded that organization after drawing on his own experiences in the military and then the challenges he faced after medical retirement. So through that organization, he continues his focus on commitment to service and helping fellow veterans advance and succeed. We are also very lucky to call Zach a colleague here at Atlanta History Center as our Chief Security Officer. So without further ado, I could say so much more about these three guys, but I know you want to hear from them yourself. Please join me in welcoming Jack Carr, James M. Scott, and Zach Knight.
Oh, wow, awesome. Awesome. Man, this is awesome.
Amazing.
Thank you, guys. Are these working? They're working. Amazing. Hey, thank you guys all for being here. Really appreciate it. And before we kick off, how many veterans do we have in the audience? Law enforcement, firefighters, first responders? Wow, thank you guys. Thank everybody for being here. I appreciate everyone taking the time. Oh.
So, like he said, thank you all for being here. And gentlemen, thank you all for being here. This is a monumental event here. We had some. Can y'all still hear me?
If we lost it.
Lost it. It's always going to be me, right? The professional.
You got the voice, though. Oh, mine's still working.
Yeah. Testing. Yep.
Nope. I want to start off this. So a big piece of those, for those of y'all that Beirut happened about What was the living?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to start with why I started this with Beirut, this series on different terrorist events with Beirut, and then I'll pass it over to you for that geopolitical context. But when I thought that for people who have read the thrillers, know that I weave a lot of history into those thrillers. If anyone follows me on social media, you know that I bring up different terrorist events that happen and try to just give the facts a little context in those. So I always knew I'd branch out into the nonfiction space, and when I thought that I had built up enough political capital with Simon & Schuster to be able to pitch an idea like this, I did it. And I kept coming back to Beirut 1983 as the place to start the series. There were terrorist events before, of course, terrorist events afterward. But in Beirut 1983, that really set the model and the paradigm for everything that was to follow. And there were rules that were set then in October, specifically on October 23rd, 1983, that were set by Iran. And those rules were really the same rules that we've been playing by up until just a few months ago. And I'd make an argument that things have shifted slightly, especially over the past few months. The paradigm shifted on October 7th of last year, but then really now with these new, this new offensive by Israel on the intelligence side and the military front, that those rules have started to shift. But that's why it was so important to come back to Beirut 1983 to understand the seeds of the terror that we're seeing today, because we have to understand the lessons of the past if we're going to take those lessons and apply them going forward as wisdom. So that's why it was so important to come back to Beirut 1983. And I remember as a kid that those Time and that Newsweek magazine, those were the two magazines that we got in my house. And I remember them on the dining room table there. And it was just such a seminal event in our history, particularly as our relationship pertains to the Middle East. So with that, I'll kick it over to you for the geopolitics of
Absolutely.
the day.
As we get started, real quick, I just want to draw everybody's attention. We have a couple Beirut veterans here in the audience with us who are a huge help for us. We've got right up front, we've got Dave Medeiros. And there's actually a photograph of Dave in the book. Jack just mentioned the cover magazines of Time and Newsweek. Actually, the photo that ran on this cover in October of 1983, Dave is one of the rescuers in there. And that's actually how Dave's parents knew that he was okay, is by seeing his image there. So Dave actually flew in from Maryland for today's event. Thank you so much, Dave. We could not have done it without you. Randy Gatto, our good friend there, is one of the co-founders of the... there he is. Of the Beirut Veterans of America. Literally, I reached out to Randy at the beginning, Jack and I did, and he was all on board with this project, opened up a lot of doors for us. We really could not have done it without you. He even went so far as to read an early copy of this book to make sure we didn't goof up any of the vernacular or anything. So, Randy, a tremendous thanks for all you've done and your advocacy for this project. Thank you, buddy. And we also have Will Hudson with us tonight, and Will's lovely family and some friends right up here in the front. Will's father was one of the key figures in the book. As you'll see, he was tragically killed that morning in the bombing, but Will's mom was a huge help to this book. She provided us over 600 pages of her husband's letters, including cassette recordings of his time there. So we were allowed to listen to about 9 hours of his voice, the machinery in the background and things like that. And Dr. John Hudson really kind of becomes in a lot of ways sort of the emotional heart and soul of this book. And so Will, it's so awesome. He was just up in Charleston with us last week. It's so great to see you again, see your family as well. So thank you very much for coming out. So please join us in thank you for that. So Beirut in 1983, in short, it was a total mess. And by that, I mean, it was coming off of a civil war. In fact, it was still really very much a civil war. There was a huge power struggle that had gone on in Lebanon. It was an interfaith struggle between the Christians, the Sunnis, and the Shias that had erupted in civil war in the 1970s. It sort of calmed down by the early 1980s. But that chaos of Beirut at that time period had opened itself up for foreign influences to come in. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, had decamped from Jordan into Beirut during that time period. They were using Lebanon in order to launch attacks against Israel. Of course, Israel was then retaliating against the PLO. So you had that struggle. On top of that, Syria very much wanted to get its hands on parts of Lebanon. Syria was a huge influence. And of course, into all of this mix came Iran, when they sent 800 members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard into that area, sort of the Bekaa Valley area there up along the Syrian Syrian border in order to exploit this chaos and to spread the revolution that they had begun in 1979 with the attack on our embassy in Iran at that time period. And so that's kind of, in short, what it's like. It's a civil war, so you've got all this domestic fighting going on and things like that, tensions, everybody's trying to figure out who's in charge. Then you have all these foreign influences that are in there as well. And so into this sort of mix, this stew, land the United States Marines in 1982 as an effort to bring peace.
And as the story goes on, one thing that I really love about it personally, Jack, you really humanize the events. There's a lot of research that these two gentlemen did attached to getting letters from family members and bringing the human element into a catastrophic series of events. Can you talk to us a little bit about that portion? Why was it important to you to bring in the human piece of this story?
Yeah, I didn't realize how big a part of the story it was going to be at the outset. When I initially talked to Simon & Schuster about it, it was all about grabbing the strategic, the operational, and the tactical lessons learned, because that's the least that I can do as an author today, is capture those in a work of nonfiction. Whether any of those are applied going forward, that's a different story, but at least I can do that. And then I wanted to humanize it, but I didn't realize just how much that side would overpower all the rest, meaning that becomes the heart of the story, because each one of these people, you hear 241 U.S. servicemen killed, and that's a big number. But until you hear their stories and realize each one of these people was loved by a family, and the decisions that are made up here in the executive level at the Oval Office, they're going to have multi-generational effects to the people who are out there on the front line, whether they come home or they don't come home. So that was the part that really became the book. And there's so many people. We talked about Dr. John Hudson early, who becomes the emotional heart of the story. And for those in the military here, you know that doctors are a little bit of a different breed in the military. They go to a school maybe for a couple weeks where they learn how to put their uniform on kind of right. But you're not really concerned about that. You just want them to be a good doctor, do a good root canal in the case of the dentist. You're not so worried about the other side of it. So getting to know Dr. John Hudson through these letters and through talking to other people, that's also amazing. Just hearing other people's stories about him, it shows what an incredible person that he was. And each one of these guys had stories like that. We just happen to have so many letters from Dr. John Hudson that he sent home. But everyone had a story. Everyone had a mom and a dad and sisters and brothers and all of that, which really became this story. So for me, it's about capturing that so that those people who eventually work their way into government or into the bureaucracy that surrounds government or into the higher levels of the military realize that those decisions made up here are going to filter their way all the way down to this tactical level where there's an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid standing at a post somewhere around the world, holding a rifle, off safe, finger on trigger, as a truck approaches that looks like it may be laden with explosives or it just has bad suspension. But that is the final decision maker in a chain of decision makers that starts with the President of the United States. So what they owe that kid down here at this tactical level is understanding the nature of the conflict in which we're engaged or about to engage or commit U.S. forces. And time again, we neglect to do that, but humanizing it and putting a story to each one of those 241 names and the names of the guys that are killed in the lead up to this event and the embassy bombing. That becomes the most important part.
I agree. And by show of hands, how many mil spouses, veteran allies, family members do we have in the room that might not have served but went through what he's talking about? A couple. So that's a piece that, thank y'all for being here for that. I think that's an underserved piece in the military. We talk a lot about veterans. We don't talk about family members as much and what they go through. So I love that piece of the humanizing of the story. James, for you, as we look back 40 years later, set the context a little bit about what happened during this tragedy. How do we look back on it now compared to how maybe we looked at it when it was actually unfolding?
Yeah, just kind of, before I get into that, I just want to say one add on to what Jack said there is that, we really could not have done this book without the phenomenal cooperation that we had from the Beirut veterans like Dave and Randy here and the families like Will's family and others, because, that was something from the very beginning. Jack and I were really adamant that this isn't our story, this is theirs. And we wanted to get out of the way of that. And so we tried to gather as many different stories from as many different families and individuals involved, even if it was a pull quote at the top of a chapter or just a one anecdote here or there, but to really kind of make this their book. And so we could not have done it without them. So, and sorry, remind me the last, you mentioned the...
Focusing on what happened that day, looking back at it contextually compared to maybe when it was happening, which is kind of unexpected, if you will.
Yeah, no, I think, to sort of look back on it then, if anything, this was a new form of warfare that we were just figuring out at that time period. And, Beirut at that time was, car bombs were really common. I mean, in fact, car bombs were so common in Beirut that there was actually a guy whose job it was to fuse them. He only had 8 fingers, by the way, and is an occupational hazard, I guess, at that time period in Beirut. But in a country so torn by civil war and whatnot, this was a real commonality. But all that changes with the attack on the embassy in April, because most of these car bombs were static. They were left there, somebody walks away, they're remotely detonated. The embassy was a suicide bomber. 10 seconds or less than that to drive in, hit the front of the embassy, and to blow up. And it really, nobody kind of quite understood yet that signaled a whole change in tactics. And in fact, even the Lebanese government, Lebanese military officials were telling the Americans, like, hey, this is just a weird one-off. Normally, this is not quite how it's done, but we just think this is kind of a one-off or whatnot. It's not until 188 days later, when the exact same type of tactic is done against the Marines, that there's this wake up that this is not ordinary. This is a new form of warfare. And you really see that with P.X. Kelly, who's the commandant of the Marine Corps at that point. He's testifying before Congress in November of 1983, and he's, different lawmakers are asking, about what was the security like, that morning. It was a Sunday morning, things like that. And he's getting very frustrated from that. And he says, you guys are missing the forest for the trees. He says, this is a new form of warfare. And he says, what is it going to take? Is it going to take a suicide bomber and an airplane to make people wake up to that? Of course, that's 18 years before 9/11. But it was that sort of writing was on the wall. And so I think at that point, we can look back on that now and we can see the rise of Hezbollah and the Iranian proxies and the changing of terrorism. And we see that. And at the time, we didn't quite see that. And of course, unfortunately, it cost 241 lives for that to crystallize. That's what it was.
And it really did set the tone for the last 40 years.
Yeah.
And something, Jack, when you and I spoke on my podcast, we talked about your early days. And what y'all might not know about Jack, he grew up around a lot of books, still has a lot of books, and he had 2 dreams in life, to be a Navy SEAL and to be an author. You've obviously accomplished both very well. As you were looking into the SEALs and you served 20 years there amidst a lot of the wars, how did this event impact you? Did it impact you? And then what was your experience serving in a time where this became much more commonplace?
Yeah, I mean, my first memories are of being pulled out of class. I went to my first, second, and third grade. We're a Catholic school, and pulled us out of class and went to go to pray for the Iranian hostage crisis and our hostages in Iran. So I have distinct memories of that, of watching Walter Cronkite count the days on TV. Anything that had anything remotely to do with the military and specifically terrorism would catch my eye. We had those the Time and Newsweek were the 2 magazines that came to our house. But newspapers too. Falkland Islands War was there. I was reading all about that, even though I probably couldn't really conceptualize. I was so young about what was really happening down there. And this event was certainly one that made an impact. And I knew even back then that the wars of the future would have some connection to terrorism. So my generation's war would have some connection to terrorism, even back then. So I was reading everything I could possibly find on military warfare, terrorism, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, anything that I could possibly read. And then I was also reading the thrillers back then, because typically the kind of books that I write and the books that I read back then, the protagonists had backgrounds. So I'm talking, let's say, mid-'80s here. They had backgrounds in Vietnam as a Marine sniper or Navy SEAL or Army Special Forces or CIA paramilitary or something along those lines. So I'm learning things from these authors that are essentially my professors in the art of storytelling. So Tom Clancy and Nelson DeMille and David Morrell and A.J. Quinnell and J.C. Pollock and Mark Olden and all these guys that had protagonists with a background that I wanted in real life one day. So I was reading all the fiction, I was reading all the nonfiction that I possibly could to prepare myself to go into the SEAL teams. And what I didn't know was also preparing me to write the thrillers that I would eventually write as well. But it all starts with reading.
And obviously your books have done a phenomenal job. The Terminalist series, now moving to nonfiction, I think it's been amazing to see the growth that you've had as an author, especially after the SEALs. And James, I'm curious, over the last several years, as you really depicted so well in this book, can you talk about how this was like the igniter to the war on terror, how we've seen that grow over the last 40 years, and what lessons did we learn or not learn from this book?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, that's the benefit of hindsight. We can look back now 4 decades later and really analyze it and see it. And we benefit now because of the declassification of records, the Reagan Library, we can get access to the Marine Corps records, and we can really sort of piece together the puzzle of what was going on then better now than we certainly could in the wake of that. And I know for Jack and I both, one of the things that surprised us when the first thing you do whenever you tackle a project like this is you do a literature review. And you say, what books have been done on this topic? And really, there was a book done in 1984 called The Root by Eric Hamill, and really since then there had been no other major history to tackle this. Colonel Garrity had written a memoir, and a couple of guys had written memoirs, but there was never sort of a 30,000-foot look at this topic. And so we kind of came in having an opportunity to really plow this field afresh and to see, and to benefit from the records and the declassification of all this materials to kind of, for the first time, do this. And I think one of the things that really, if anything, kind of comes out of is you see, or this is the beginning of the proxy warfare that Jack has talked about, where, Iran is going to start utilizing, because Iran can't fight a state-on-state war against the Israelis or the United States. They're going to use these proxies to harass different elements. I think kind of one of the biggest lessons that anybody took out of this was, of course, Iran. They were able, for the inexpensive price of a truck, some explosive, and a volunteer's life, they were able to completely deter American goals. And eventually, the United States packs up. We leave Lebanon. We never retaliate. So Iran learns on top of all that, hey, there are no consequences of this action. And it really, as Jack said earlier, this sort of set the ground rules that we've seen for the last 4 decades. And it's not just the Iranians that learn lessons. Other countries take away from this as well. So, I think that's one of the key lessons that came out of this is the impunity with which these groups can operate. Up until, recently, as we've seen with the Israelis, but at that time, that's kind of the lesson I think they took.
Yeah, it taught them that terrorism works.
Yeah.
And more specifically, it works through proxies. And they got the most powerful government or country in the world. They reached the political end that they wanted through an act of violence, and they've been playing by that ever since. So there's many parallels. We talked about the parallels to today. You talk about parallels between what happened recently, August of 2021 at Abbey Gate in Afghanistan. You have a group of U.S. servicemen and women in that case put in a tactically disadvantageous position, an untenable position, just like the Marines were put in Beirut. And we have a similar outcome. And they were put there by people in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away from the battlefields. But that outcome is a bomb going off in both places. And in both places, though, there's something else that happens, and that is those people who are blown off their feet, who hear that explosion from across a compound or across the airfield, they come running to the sound of that explosion. They come running to the sound of the guns to try to save as many of their brothers in arms as they possibly can in the case of Beirut, and brothers and sisters in arms in the case of Abbey Gate, and also innocent Afghan civilians in the case of Abbey Gate as well. While some are holding security because they didn't know if it was going to be, it was the first in a series of attacks. But that's that same 18, 19, 20-year-old kid I was talking about that is going to that rubble, digging their buddies out with their bare hands, K-bar knives, maybe a shovel, maybe a crowbar if they can find it. But that's that same service member that ran to the sound of the explosion at Abbey Gate. So there are parallels at the tactical, the operational, and the strategic levels, unfortunately. But let me say, I'm laying down a positive note, though, because what happens after this bomb goes off is one of the greatest rescue efforts in modern U.S. history. And this entire building comes down. You have 350, mostly Marines, but service members in this headquarters and barracks building. It's essentially gone, and now the rescue efforts begin. And you have two dentists that aren't trained for this. But Dr. John Hudson had taken them through these different protocols just to prepare them for something that he sensed was on the horizon. And so now you have these two dentists who are supposed to be doing root canals, who are now in charge of rescue and recovery operations. Then you have a rabbi and a Christian chaplain that are digging through the rubble as well, administering last rites, but pulling people from the rubble as part of the rescue efforts at the same time. So you have this incredible rescue effort in the wake of these explosions. So that part gives me hope.
Yeah. And as I'm asking these questions, y'all, we are going to have a time for Q&A for the crowd. So make sure y'all are prepping a few questions for these two gentlemen. And as we're talking about these series of events, obviously there's a lot of emotion tied into it. In order to go through a story like this and draw from the emotion of the people involved, you mentioned earlier how there's a connection between the two of you. I would love to hear more about how did you find James to be a part of this book? Obviously, you recruited top talent to really bring in a piece of that. But can you talk about how y'all have founded a relationship attached to this book and then the impact it's had on you individually as you've written it?
Absolutely. When I started down this path, I knew that, well, in the thrillers, if I get something wrong, I try not to, and I don't think I ever have. But if I ever did, then I could say, hey, it's fiction. And you don't have that luxury with a book like this, especially one where you have family members who lost loved ones. You have people who are still with us who are digging through that rubble, pulling bodies out of that rubble, saving their friends. So I wanted to be as thoughtful and respectful as I possibly could as I approached this. So you can't get something wrong in this. So I knew I wanted to partner with somebody who knew what they were doing in this space. And when I was on the phone for my first call with Simon & Schuster about it, my editor and publisher and my agent at the same time, I said, hey, there's only one person I want to work with. His name's James Scott. He has 5 books out there, 4 on World War II, 1 on the USS Liberty. And if you haven't read them and added them to your library, you should definitely do that today. You're welcome. No, they're fantastic. So all I knew was his work, which is strange now, but I think I was just too busy to even look into anything else other than the work. But now looking back on it, I should have at least looked at a YouTube video to see if you were a crazy person or something.
Yes, for the record, he is.
But yeah, I didn't do that. I loved the work. But now I like that. Now that I like that it was just about the work. And so I had your most recent book there. I had all of them, but my agent and publisher, they asked, well, who's his agent? And I go to that acknowledgments or the author's note, and I said, well, he's thanking some guy named John Glussman. And my editor, Emily Bessler, said, well, that's my husband. I thought, well, this is very convenient for me. So they put us in contact, and we hit it off right away. And it's grown an amazing friendship right from the get-go, an incredible partnership. But when you do something like this, it has to be right. I didn't want to just read a bunch of books on the Middle East and terrorism and then regurgitate those as, give my analysis as some sort of kind of pop history, just to get something out there. I wanted this to be an actual work of history, primary sources, interviews, and I want it to be done right with someone who knows how to go into the archives, knows who to contact, knows how to properly annotate everything. If you see there's a notes section in the back of the book is fairly robust. And then the photos as well, doing that correct way. The photos was interesting. It's my first time having to deal with that. And there were some photos that we wanted to use, and I forget it was like Getty or AP or one of those that you'd know. And their business is licensing photos. And the company had changed hands so many times since 1983. UPI. Yeah. And they couldn't tell us who actually owned the rights to some of these photos, which was amazing to me. I was like, well, isn't this your business? Yeah. I don't understand. But so we got some great photos in here, regardless. Some never before seen as well. But I wanted all that to be done right. And we talked for the first time, hit it off, talked about the vision right away from the get-go. It was all about getting out of the way of the story, like James mentioned. We were both on the same page as far as all that goes. And then I just so happened to hit James up at a good time. After all those books on World War II, you were thinking about making what to do next.
Yeah. So, well, let me just start off by saying when Jack Carr calls you up, you just say yes. All right. So,
very kind.
I mean, I had actually watched the Terminalist series, loved it, had jumped into the books, was reading through those, and then my editor actually had reached out to me and John Glussman and said, by the way, your agent, whose daughter had a baby, wasn't responding to emails, and he's like, it's totally inappropriate for me to be basically acting as your agent here and telling you this, but you need to tell your agent to check her email. And so it was funny because when all of it was kind of coming together, it was during the tail end of the pandemic, I guess. And so they were all kind of remotely working. And my editor was at home and his wife was there. And he walked outside to talk to me about it all. And he's like, so his wife wouldn't hear. And he goes, I'm just going to tell you one thing, James, just don't screw this up. But I could not have been more thankful for this awesome opportunity to partner with Jack, because he's, just a phenomenal guy. And, the Jack you see here and the Jack you read about and see on podcasts and everything like that is you're just a top-notch individual. And Jack's right. I mean, from the very beginning, there's a lot of history books that kind of get turned out by just using secondary sources and things like that. And from the beginning, that was not the goal here. We really wanted to plow new ground, as I noted earlier, really get into the interviews, get into the documents, and sort of make real history out of this. And so we did over 100 hours of interviews with survivors, with family members. We got over 1,000 pages of letters and diaries, probably more than 10,000 pages of Marine Corps documents and Reagan Library documents. That's the meeting minutes, the agendas, the policy papers from the Marine Corps. It was the monthly command chronologies, the weekly sit reps, the daily message traffic and things like that. And then, to synthesize all that. But we wanted to do it right, and we wanted it to be, primary source driven, and I think I think that really kind of came together here, and we tremendously benefited from the declassification of so much of this, and the ability to have that new material. So.
Yeah, and I thought you could just knock one of these things out every year like you do a thriller. And so that's what I pitched Simon & Schuster. So the thrillers will be in the spring and the nonfiction will be in the fall. And about 2 weeks into the process, I called them back and I said, I know what I said and I know what the contract says. But we're gonna have to extend that deadline by a couple of years because to do it right, it really takes it takes how long it takes. It takes as long as it's gonna take. So now we're on the 2-year-ish program. So we'll see. But
it was funny because we were actually doing a podcast recently with Annie Jacobson, who's a phenomenal writer. Her book Nuclear War or whatnot. And Jack was like, "So Annie, how long does it typically take to do one of these books?" And she's like, 2 years. I was like, "See, I told you."
Yeah. Well, you didn't tell me. Yeah, it's quite obvious. As soon as we started. Yeah.
So in order to save James on this one a little bit, if you have a book, hold it up. If you already grabbed your book, okay. So for all of you that didn't get a book yet, go buy a book when we're over, because I want to make sure James is covered for the next book, okay? One of the pieces of the book that I found really fascinating, and I'd love to hear from both of y'all. There's a piece in there that mentions it's like that area of the world can't work without war, and they don't know how to function without a war happening as their background and their history. Can y'all talk a little bit about that, and then how you've seen that change or not change over the last couple decades?
It's one of those ones that's a whole book.
Yeah, it is. Why don't you take this one?
That's what if you buy the book, they'll explain it more.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, those power dynamics at play that James talked about in the beginning really haven't changed, and they're not unique to Lebanon. There are different sects and different factions of all these different religions throughout the Middle East, and of course, then you throw oil into the mix, and the joke is, of course, usually from the British back then in the early 50s, what is our oil doing under their sand? And that really, if you could go back to 1953, oh my goodness, I have my phone on this thing. I'll tell you what, it's on airplane mode, and it still buzzes sometimes. It's that calendar that I told. Yeah, it's that calendar thing. So you can go back to those early days of us installing essentially a puppet government, or helping to, along with the British, that also sets the tone for a lot of this. And that's really the roots of what happens if we see in 1979 with Iran go back to 1953 and us meddling in the affairs of another country over there. And in that case, that was specifically about oil in conjunction with our friends in the UK. So there's all these power dynamics at at play, from the religious side, the Sunni, the Shia, Christians. I have Israel thrown into the mix, of course, with a history from the late 40s onward. You have us sticking our heads in there. You have the British sticking our heads in there. You have private companies as well. So all of this creates an environment just ripe for exploitation by all of those different factions. So with all of those different dynamics at play, I don't see how you can't have multiple wars going really from the end of World War II up to today, if we're just looking at modern history. So I would say and all of those same factions and entities are still at play today. Yeah. So very few of those have actually changed.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, no.
How's that?
That's awesome, dude. Yeah, you PhD, man, right there.
It's like you learned something from James on that one.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's so no. Jack's absolutely right. And also, I mean, there's the whole post-colonialism side to it all. You know, the Ottoman Empire collapse and all that. You know, the British Mandate and things of that nature. And so many of these countries weren't actually drawn on maps based on, you know, who lived well with whom and things of that nature. And so you have these, you know, these it basically comes down to power and control. I mean, who's going to be in charge? And I think you see that in Iraq, you see that in Lebanon, you see that in so many of these places. And at the heart of that, often it comes down to who's Sunni and who's Shia in a lot of ways, and or who's Christian thrown in a lesser degree. But in Lebanon, that was actually a big part of it, at least initially in the 1940s, 1950s, until the demographics began to change. And the Christians then became a much, much smaller demographic there. So. Yeah, you nailed it, Jack.
Do you have any other softball questions like that?
Yeah.
I mean, geez.
I'm just setting up.
Can we get another moderator up here?
Hey.
I mean, yeah.
This is a series, y'all. I'm setting up the next book for y'all. Speaking on that this is something where there's so much to unfold over the last several decades. Can you talk a little bit about the future of Targeted as a series? Y'all's work together, how y'all are shaping that into more in the future?
Yeah, so James had to put a book on hold because John Glusman is a smart man and wanted to stay married to Emily Bessler, so he had to put the last book that he'd committed to on hold, which is about the 3 days between Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so that'll be coming out here soon on your end. But we know what we're doing next, and we can always shift it. But we started the initial work on something coming next. It'll probably be announced at least in 2025. And so we'll go forward from there.
Yeah. James, I know you're doing things beyond this as well. Talk a little bit about your future.
Yeah, so as Jack noted, I've got this other project due, and it's so funny because Emily actually came to Maryland a few nights ago and for our event there, and so she was literally, that night I got an email from John Glusman, and I think and he was like, so just checking on you, how things are going and all, making sure I'm still at work. Like I'm working on it. I was on the plane today. I was working on it. Don't trust me. So it's coming together. But yeah, once I've got to get this project wrapped up, hopefully by the end of the year, and then we'll be moving forward with the next Targeted book.
Love it.
So, we both have books due about the same time. My deadline might push a month or two to the right. But that's just how it goes. And there's actually a soft launch of the next book for those who follow the thriller series. The description of the next one went out on Amazon last week that you can find out there. I'll announce it on Friday, I think. But if you go to it right now, you can find the title and what the next, I'll say, James Reese universe book is going to be about. So
I'll add one thing. He's without a doubt the hardest working guy I know out there. He's built this huge enterprise here, and it's so funny. I always give him a hard time about this because 3 o'clock in the morning, my phone is on my bedside table and it'll vibrate, and he'll be texting, and I'm like, that cat just doesn't sleep. I mean, you just literally bring like that.
Me too.
Like that seal determination and work ethic to writing, and it's why you've been so successful, man.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Now, he just complimented him very heavily. I do have to make one jab at Jack. How many people have actually watched Terminal List, the series, Amazon Prime? Lots of people. Y'all remember back in season 3 when Chris Pratt was a better shot and actually may have not let Jack stay in the series? Do y'all remember that? I had to make fun. Navy SEALs, they got to learn to shoot a little bit better. Go Army, right? Sorry.
So if you missed it, it's early on in episode 3, but I had to have a little chat with Chris Pratt on set that day and let him know that if this was to go down in real life, things would have ended a little differently. I want to make sure that we were clear on that.
I'm making fun of him. I have a lot of witnesses. Stay around me, please. Joking aside, this book is carrying a lot of impact for the families, the people involved. Can y'all discuss a little bit your individual desire to see the impact of these stories of the targeted side, and in this book specifically? What's the impact you hope to bring to the awareness or to the lives of those involved?
Yeah, that was something I didn't really think about too much at the outset, probably because it's my first foray down this road. When James does his work in the past, not the USS Liberty, but the works on World War II, those guys are getting up there in age, and a lot of stuff is archival in nature. So I guess I didn't know. I'm so focused all the time and running 1,000 miles an hour, but that's been the most powerful part of all of this, is those relationships with these guys who were there, with the family members who lost loved ones, and that's been the most powerful part of it. And I didn't know until I guess a couple months into it how, and I'll say this generally, but I think it is almost to a person, that a lot of these guys felt that the Marine Corps moved on fairly quickly in the wake of this event. It wasn't raising the flag on Iwo Jima. It was a dark day in Marine Corps history, and just like any large organization, they want to move on from the darker days fairly quickly. And there also weren't that many people who were stationed there who spent time in Beirut in 82 and 83. It's a very small group of people, relatively speaking. It wasn't World War II that affected a generation. It wasn't Vietnam that affected a generation, whether you were down, you were in Vietnam, or you were at home just witnessing the civil upheaval, whether in the streets personally or just in newspaper and television. So those parts of it, the relationships with the veterans of Beirut, and just hearing the thank you for telling our story. And for us, it's the opposite side of that. It's like, wow, this is a distinct honor to tell this story, and it's so humbling to tell this story. So it became quite emotional. But it was the honor of a lifetime to do this.
Yeah. No, I'd say, it's, when we show up on your doorstep, we're asking about the worst day of your life. And you're asking somebody to trust you and to tell you that story, and that you're going to get it right. And they're handing over their letters, in some cases the last letters from their loved ones. They're handing you their diaries. You're getting a window into an incredible moment of anguish. And that's a privilege and an honor, and we take that very seriously. Jack talked earlier about the precision and the demand to get it right. That's the mantra that we live by with this, because these are. I'm looking at Will, I'm looking at Dave, I'm looking at Randy. I don't see rocks in any of their hands right now. Maybe when we get out of here later, but we have our duty is to tell their story and get it right. And for us, it's an honor. They trust us, they share it, and as we said earlier, we just want to get out of the way of it and let their story be front and center, and us as the writers follow the backdrop of it.
And one thing you sent me early on, it was the first letter that you sent. It was a handwritten letter sent home, and there was a Polaroid attached to it, and this guy standing in front of a Jeep. And I remember reading that letter. It was so emotional, and seeing that photo. And I remember, if I had seen this in 1983 when I was seeing those Time magazine and those Newsweek magazine covers, and I'd seen this photo as a kid, I would have thought, man, look how old this guy is. and then now I look at it and I say, oh my gosh, look how young this guy was.
Yeah.
These guys were all so young.
Yeah, we have kids about that age, we have 2 high schoolers at home. It's, a lot of these guys were 18, 19, 20 years old, so it's, thrown into this hostile, this incredibly violent world. It was, the Wild West there. It was the center of the world's violence right there at that time period.
Well, the impact of this book, I think, is amazing. The work y'all are doing is absolutely phenomenal. As we move into the Q&A, y'all, let's give them a round of applause real quick. Now we have the lovely Claire that's going to walk the room, pass the mic a little bit. One thing that we ask, we only have about 15 or 20 minutes for this piece, so try to not ask questions like I did about a whole nother novel that they're going to unfold. But please, whoever's ready, there we go.
That was a good one. I hadn't had that one before, so that was good.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a success in my
mind. Yeah, no, that's really good.
Great. I want to say again, thanks for being here. It's a 3-part question, but I'll try to make it.
Next.
One, exactly. With Lebanon kind of being set up by the French to have this delicate balance between the Maronite Christians and the Sunnis, I guess, that did kind of work for a while, this delicate balance. Why was the PLO invited to decamp to Lebanon after being in Transjordan and Black September, I guess, I think was related with that? Why were they allowed or permitted or invited to come and set up operations there? Number two, had they stayed in
should we start with one?
Yeah.
I do one first? Yeah, let's do one first.
All right, you got to read the book. That's answered.
It's in there.
Next? No, I'm kidding. No, but it is addressed in the book. But in short, they weren't really invited to be there. They just took advantage of the fact that Lebanon at that point was embroiled in this huge civil war, and therefore they could just sort of slide in. They then go on to create massive amounts of domestic tension there because as the PLO is set up and they're using Lebanon as a base to attack Israel, Israel starts to retaliate against the PLO, and it of course creates Beirut just gets shelled and destroyed and things like that. Then you start having the locals, particularly the Maronite Christians, starting to put pressure on the military, saying, all right, we got to do what Jordan did and we got to kick the PLO out. That's when the United States comes back in 1982 to help facilitate the exodus of the PLO.
Right, which they fell short on and did not put the troops in that they said they were going to, if I understand, if my reading of other books is correct. So had the PLO stayed in Lebanon, and I understand there's a little bit of kind of odd bedfellows. The PLO actually provided some safe passage and some security for U.S. diplomats and State Department folks there. Would these bombings have occurred if the PLO had stayed in Lebanon? And then the third part of the question is, this other book said, hey, Hezbollah kind of came up in the vacuum. A lot of these ancillary employees or associates that were not officially with the PLO kind of started Hezbollah after the PLO left. And so I guess the question is, I guess that's not necessarily two-part, but would the bombings have occurred had the PLO stayed in Lebanon?
Yeah, I think they would have, and I'll tell you why. I think the Iran was not interested in the struggle for the Palestinians. I mean, Iran was interested in spreading the revolution and saw the opportunity to plant its seeds in the chaos that was the soil of Lebanon at that period. And so the PLO were just one of many different sort of foreign influences that were at play there. The Syrians were also doing it. The Iranians, of course, came in. So I think Iran had a very different goal than the PLO. They were certainly utilizing some of the same forces, of course, using the impoverished Muslims there, the Shia and whatnot. But I think Iran, they were coming in whether the PLO was there or not. In fact, they were already coming in 1982 as the PLO was still, I mean, and of course there were still Palestinians there. I mean, it's just the PLO fighters that left, but they left behind the Palestinian refugee camps, which were filled with men, women, and children. So yeah, I think totally it would have happened. Different agendas, different organizations. Yep.
Thank you. I was wondering for what reason the United States did not retaliate for the bombing, and if they did retaliate, would have prevented similar things in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the question, right? So if you retaliate after this event, does that change the model going forward? Does it change that paradigm? And probably it changes it to a certain extent. And then if they try something like that again through proxies and you retaliate in a certain way, taking lessons from your first one, maybe it does change that dynamic. Certainly, it's like that butterfly effect, even. But yeah, I mean.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think why we didn't at the time is Caspar Weinberger killed the operation that had been planned for it. And Weinberger never wanted to be in Lebanon anyway. He saw Lebanon and so did the Joint Chiefs as a distraction from the larger Cold War. It was what was going on in Lebanon was a bunch of proxies. You had the Soviets sort of in the backdrop pushing the Syrians, rearming them, things like that. Putting U.S. forces on the ground there and Joint Chiefs Chairman John Vesey said, look, you never want Americans in between different factions in Lebanon. Of course, that's exactly what happened. All we were doing was increasing the exposure for the American troops there, which is ultimately, sadly, what happened there. I think Weinberger's view of retaliation was we just run the risk of escalating conflict in a region where he didn't want to be anyway. And so you go and retaliate, and then that puts the pressure on the Iranians to retaliate again. And he was just willing to just cut losses and get out. And I think that's why we didn't ultimately retaliate.
Nice hat, by the way.
Hey, thank you very much. Love it.
Everyone just like it.
I love it.
Thank you. Actually, my question is along the same lines of the retaliation. I've been traveling a lot and listening to the audio version of the book, so I'm farther along, about chapter 17. But I was curious what you thought specifically, Jack, about the retaliation question in regards to, do you think, had we retaliated with anything, would this kind of warfare still be practiced? I mean, you've been in country. I mean, you've been there. I mean, it's like.
Yeah, no, I think it certainly would exist. It's a form of warfare. It's a very effective form of warfare, as we've seen through this model. But there are certain things that you can do, I think. So let's take Israel as an example. I mean, the October 7th was a huge failure of intelligence, obviously, for Israel, and for its intelligence service and its military. But up to that point, it had kind of built up. I won't say not invincibility, but that had this aura and this kind of this mythology surrounding it because of things like Operation Wrath of God and other things in their history. They have been using their intelligence services to very effectively target key leaders in Iran, in Syria, in other places, to kind of keep this steady state of, it's horrible to say, but an acceptable level of violence that does not escalate things into a broader regional conflict. That changed on October 7th, both of those things. Essentially, a red line was crossed. The model was shifted a bit with that attack. That was not an acceptable level of violence that we'd seen for the previous couple decades, essentially, with a couple other kind of tipping points in there as well. But now they have to build that up. And over the past couple months, we've seen them building that back up, kind of what they had before, that fear of the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence service, that unknowing, how are they doing this? How are they targeting these key Iranian scientists in Iran? How are they using Israeli operatives? Or this is a proxy force of Israel's at work here. But those questions that keep their enemies looking over their shoulders. They lost that on October 7th, and they've been building that up over the last couple months. So we saw with the pagers, we saw that with the walkie-talkies. We see the targeting of key individuals, a very impressive special operations mission into Syria about 3 weeks ago now, where they used drones essentially as a blocking force, the same way our special operations would use Rangers, but targeting key installations. So I think we could have done similar things like that builds up this more of an aura around our intelligence and our military that keeps our enemies looking behind their shoulder, wondering how we're doing this, but doing it better than anyone else has ever done it in history. So we missed a lot of those opportunities from 1983 onward. We have a lot of these capabilities. We don't necessarily exercise them. And does this then of course comes the question, you're just creating more terrorists by doing this? Maybe. That's also, but you certainly create a lot more by going into a country for 20 years and kicking indoors every night. That certainly does it. Does this other way do it that's more strategic, but also just with more pinpoint accuracy with the end result in mind, meaning you're doing these operations, planning them backwards. What end result do you want? So how do you get there? Instead of the opposite, which we oftentimes do. We do something and then we try to figure it out and figure out the PR, what we want afterward, and then shift it along the way. So figure out that end result that you want and then work backwards from there. Israel did that very effectively over their history. We have not done that very effectively, but I think we could do it a lot better.
Hey, thanks for being here today. We really appreciate it and love your work, both with the military and with the books and the TV series. My question is about Iran. Our American policy has been all over the page with Iran since post-World War II, from containment to appeasement to fighting, which you were participating in. And it's a huge problem, obviously. Now, we've got a theocracy that's apparently weeks away from having a nuclear weapon. They hate us. They profess to hate us. What should be the American policy in dealing with this? It's been an abject failure. What should it be?
I think it's really the Israeli policy is the one that's most important. We've kind of guided some of that over the years, that I would say, probably up until just the last couple months, really. But it's really the Israeli policy is the one that matters, because they're the ones on that doorstep. They're the ones that are really worried about that nuclear bomb that might be weeks away or months away or years away, wherever that is. They're the ones that are the 5-meter target for those in the military. They're that first target. So it's really their policy is the one that matters most. Of course, ours with finances and really allowing Iran to fund these proxies through some deals that might not have made much sense. There are those, but then it's really the Israeli ones, because they're not gonna, I would guess, that they are not gonna allow Iran to get a nuclear bomb. They will escalate things into a broader regional war before they allow Iran, this is just a guess, to get a nuclear capability like that. So if it really is like days and weeks away, I would expect a very strong military and intelligence focus from Israel on Iran that changes that in the shorter term. I don't know. Give thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll tell you, I'm not sure we're not heading into that phase right now. I mean, I was just looking online earlier today, and I saw that, one of Iran's supreme leaders are hiding underground in bunkers right now. I mean, they're not doing that, just for fun. I mean, I think they're reading the tea leaves in the region and seeing a serious escalation here that Jack was talking about, and are taking precautions. Although given how things went down in in Lebanon with Hezbollah recently, I may not be hiding in an underground bunker. Certainly wouldn't be using my pager. But I'm not sure we're not in that process of watching it now. I mean, you've got, we're at a point now where, we've got a president who is not running again. So we have a bit of a lame duck situation here. We've got Netanyahu, who has, his own political challenges at home, who is, is basically running the war there, and we're seeing it escalating. So, I mean, we'll see. I mean, Jack noted the next few days, next few weeks will be very telling.
This question is for Jack. How have your former books and writing style affected this book?
That's a great question. So it's interesting. We started in a very similar way to the thrillers. I start with a title. I start with a theme. I start with a one-page executive summary, kind of like you'd read on the back of a book jacket or a back of a paperback type thing, and then I turn that into an outline. And it's very similar to the way we started. We had a title. We wanted to capture these lessons. We wanted to humanize these events. And then we knew where we were going to start right away. We knew we were going to start with the April embassy bombing, and then we're going to work through that spring, summer, into the fall, and then the bombing on October 23rd, and then the rescue efforts, and then also capture some of those lessons from the higher executive levels with recently declassified documents and Reagan's diaries and those sorts of things, and then us leaving, and then ultimately at the time anyway, the killing of one of the, I don't like to use the word mastermind, I like to use the word lead planner, and his killing in Damascus, Syria in 2008, all those years later, and was probably a joint Israeli intelligence, U.S. intelligence operation that takes him off the board. So we had the elements of a thriller in it. And then writing style-wise, it was, again, about getting out of the way and letting it be the voices of those who were there. So there was a lot of similarities when it came to planning and execution.
I have a similar question. Jack, you famously have a unique writing process as you go to a different location to write your thriller series. So did you do anything like that for this, or do you have a unique way of a writing process when it comes to this nonfiction book?
No, so do you mean research-wise or just places to go?
Either one.
Yeah, well, the research, just for a little background on the thriller side of the house, my idea was always to go to someplace really cool and weave that into the thrillers. So I'd already been to Iraq and Afghanistan, not that those are cool places. I mean, there are beautiful spots.
We're really great in the summer.
Yeah, northern Iraq, there's some beautiful spots in northern Iraq. There's some really beautiful spots in Afghanistan. But I'd been to most of those places. For the next book, True Believer, I went to Mozambique because I knew that was going to be a very important part of the story. I hadn't been there, so I went there for a couple weeks. And then Savage Son, I went to Kamchatka Peninsula, Russia. Did that. I'd already been, and then I chose places I'd been before. I'd been to Moscow. I'd been to Ukraine before my time in the military, actually. I'd been to Morocco. So I chose these different places that I'd been, but my idea was always to go somewhere else. And then COVID hit. And luckily, I was for The Devil's Hand, so I was mostly U.S. based, not totally, but mostly. So I was like, okay, this thing will be over pretty soon. 2 weeks, it'll be over. Let's flatten this curve and move on. Yeah. And then for the next one, I really wanted to get to Israel, but COVID was still going on. Anybody who tried to get to Israel during COVID knew, even if an Israeli citizen, it was very difficult to get in and out of that country. And then for the next one, I wanted to go to Israel as well. Still an issue. And now, obviously, it became an issue again for other reasons. So my plan was always to go to at least one place. Anybody who read, was it Red Sky Morning or Only the Dead? The Colorado places were supposed to be Argentina. So I did a great trip to Argentina and got to write it off because but it's nice. But then I got to that part in the narrative, and it just didn't make sense to keep it Argentina. I had to switch it to Colorado. So I'll use Argentina again in a future.
What you guys are hearing here is it's really about write-offs. You get a great trip out of it, and then
I was going there.
I mean, it's like, look, you gotta take it where you can get it, right?
It's a perk, yeah. But then in the actual physical, we talk about this, like where we go to physically write is places where we're not going to be interrupted. So James has an amazing place in his house. It's very cool. It's very hard to get to for the rest of the family. And then I try to do that in mine, but then I close the door, and it's like a magnet. It's like a magnet for kids, wife, dog, like everything. You close that door, it's like everybody all of a sudden wants to interrupt you. So it's a constant struggle. It's a constant struggle.
Yeah, as Jack mentioned, we have a Victorian house, so it's got a cupola, so it's up on the third floor there. So it's 12 by 12. It's basically, my kids called it Rapunzel's Tower when they were little, but it's basically a jail cell. And my wife has designed it that way on purpose because in our old house, I had like the whole third floor. And so I had this old sofa up there. And then at one point I told her I was getting some bookcases put in. And I was like, do you want to be here when I meet with the cabinet maker? And she's like, no, I trust you. And then a couple months later, the cabinet maker came to install them, and she kept asking what the 60-inch cutout in the middle was for. And I said, that's for the widescreen TV I'm putting up here. and so when we moved, I got this 12 by 12 tower. That's just enough for him for a desk and some books.
I have to ask, is the lock on the inside or the outside?
Yeah, that's right. I need some really long hair is what I need to do to get out of it. So, yeah.
Nice. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. A couple things. Number one, I think I speak for a lot of people and say I really hope you guys continue with the Lebanon theme, Benghazi. I really hope you guys do that, number one. Number two, there's an element whenever you write a book like this that changes you guys personally. So hearing these stories from these brave men and women, these families of these veterans, how did it change you guys personally?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes part of our experience now. Just like anything else in life, it becomes part of that foundation that you're building upon going forward. So it's been extremely impactful to me, but it becomes part of that experience. And I'm sure there'll be things that I learned during the course of this that'll weave their way into the thrillers and that will inform other parts of future books in the targeted series. So just like anything else in life, you internalize it, it becomes a part of you, and you're the custodian of that and those emotions, and as you move forward, and then hopefully take some of those lessons and things you learned from others and pass them on to whatever your circle is, whether that's a spouse, kids, or however social media now or whatever it might be. But it'll certainly become a part of me.
Yeah, I'll add. I mean, it has a huge effect on you. I mean, I read all of Will's dad's 641 pages of letters, and I knew his fate as I read each one. In the top right-hand corner, he wrote how many days he'd been on the beach and how many days he had left. And I think in the end, he got down, it was like 20 days left. And I knew when I got to the last letter. And you have these moments, and you're just, it's, another story is one of the chaplains we wrote about, Danny Wheeler, who was, he was on the fourth floor of the building when the bomb went off. Falls all the way down in the rubble, wakes up the next day, never hears the blast. never feels himself falling, any of that, just wakes up in this there's an A-frame between two walls that has sort of sheltered him. And on one of the walls, all the chaplains before him had written a blessing, and he'd done the same thing, and they called it the blessing wall. And he's trapped there, protected by this blessing wall. And 1 hour turns to 2 hours. It's dark. The air is full of concrete dust. It's acrid, and you can smell the fires burning underground and things like that. And he initially starts replaying Louis L'Amour novels in his head. All his Louis L'Amour's characters were trapped in cave-ins and things of that nature and had to dig their way out. And so he's replaying all those, and 2 hours turns to 3 hours, and finally dawns on him he might not make it out. And here he is, this chaplain with 3 young kids, ages 7, 5, and 3, and he has this huge conversation with God. He's a chaplain. He says, God, did you bring me here to kill me? Is this your plan? And he's angry and he's hostile about it. And who wouldn't be? And so he hears God speaks to him. And he says, don't worry, I've got this. And soon thereafter, a hand comes down through the rubble. And Danny Wheeler is the last soul God delivered alive from that wreckage. And I've done interviews for over 20 years. I've interviewed atomic bomb survivors, atrocity victims, bomber pilots, submarine skippers, you named it. And that interview just choked me up. And I've talked to Danny a number of times. Jack and I have interviewed him together. And every time I hear it, just telling you that story now, I get goosebumps. It's just, it's just those stories become a part of you. And again, as we said earlier, we are so thankful for people like Danny, Dave, Randy, Will, your family, for providing them for us, so that we can then share them with you guys.
And they found him because there was a vestment, or the religious vestment was caught, and they could see that, and they started digging there and pulled him out of the rubble.
It's like a purple pennant in a land, that had been his Advent stole.
Yeah, and you have Don.
One of the other chaplains saw it and said, "That's Danny's stole." Yeah. Nobody else would have recognized it, but another chaplain. Yeah. He said, "Dig here."
Yeah,
and it led down to him.
And then you have Don Howell, who is, and you can hear these guys. We did podcast series with some of these guys as well, and he decided to spend the night in the basement that night, and that's because they had some alarm went off, and so they had to go down from the other floors and go down and take cover in the basement. And instead of going back up to his rack, he decided to stay down in the basement because he had a cot down there, and bomb goes off, and the rest of the building collapses essentially on top of him. And there's somebody near him who wasn't near him moments before, and that was somebody who wrote it down from the 4th deck all the way down. And it's totally dark. He closes his eyes and says a prayer, opens them, and there's a little shaft of light coming through, and he starts digging himself out of the rubble.
Yeah. We just have time for 2 more questions this afternoon. I apologize because I'm not going to be able to get to everyone, but one here and then one in the back. But thank y'all so much.
Well, first of all, thank you. You men are the best of the best, and we all appreciate that. But everything has a cause and effect. And having lived in the Middle East, I know that 1983 followed the Baca Valley incidents. And the public, by reading these wonderful books and listening to many outlets now, are far more aware than we were 10, 20, 30 years ago. And so that mothers don't lose more of their well-meaning sons in wars, I want to suggest that we have a lack of diplomacy and a lack of understanding other cultures. And we have to accept culpability at times. Many are not our enemies that we profess to be our enemies. And I would like to see more efforts towards diplomacy and your fine experience and your courage to have courage on the diplomatic side. It's 2024. Thank you so much, Jack.
Yeah. Yeah, part of that is understanding those cultures that you talked about. It's so important to the overall understanding of an enemy, who is, who isn't, maybe one that's adapting to you, putting yourself in their shoes, asking what they would do next, the what if kind of scenarios. But it all comes from an understanding of those areas of the world, the people that are there, the different factions, understanding the complexities, the language, all of those things that come into play that we tend to gloss over or not pay attention to because of an imperial hubris that infects us at those levels. So certainly an understanding is key to decision making.
I retired after 35 years, being in the military for 30, and I may be a little bit rusty, but I have kept up with things, and I have a question for you, sir. When you were starting out this presentation, you listed the countries that were involved, and I noticed that you did not include Israel, which has always been a major force in the Middle East, and I was curious about why.
Oh, usually I do. Usually I say Israel. I talk about the Sunni, the Shia, the Maronites, the Druze, Israel coming in and out at certain times. You have the established government, you have the United States, you have Iran, you have Syria, all the proxy forces that also differ by neighborhood, depending. So I usually mention all of those things as being dynamics.
I lied. We have one more question.
Process, not politics. I'm just curious. I assume neither one of you have ever had a co-author, so I was curious how that process worked, and was there some point during this process, I'm not sure how long it was, where you started to regret your decision of this?
Yeah, I can answer that easily. I did not regret my decision at all. It might be different for James, but no, not at all. And it's interesting because it's kind of a morph of, so the thrillers are all me, and if people don't like them, there's no one to blame but myself. And then the screenwriting side of the house, when I went into that a couple of years ago for The Terminal List, and now this Dark Wolf prequel series, and then moving into True Believer here in early 2025, that is a very collaborative process. That are hundreds of people. You see a writer's name attached to an episode, and yeah, they were kind of assigned that one in the writer's room, but there are hundreds of people that give input into that script. So very as collaborative as it can possibly be, with the end result of trying to make the best show you can possibly make. So that's one extreme up there, the hundreds of people with notes all the way to the top of Amazon and back down that need to be addressed. You need to figure out if we're gonna draw your line in the sand, or where you need to, or what you can accept, or what were actually good notes coming back down. And then I don't get really any of that on the thriller side. The things I'll get from my editor will be like, hey, explain this for someone who wasn't in the military, or explain this for someone who hasn't read all the previous books. Those are typically the ones I get, but that's about all I get on the thriller side of the house. Never do they try to guide anything, as far as politics or guide the story or anything along those lines. They'll have complete creative control. And then this is like a morph of those together. So it's a collaborative effort, but it's one in where you don't have to deal with hundreds of people, and we were on the same page from day one. So I can't think of a better co-author, or better friend to do this with.
I'd say it's just super easy. I mean, no, and there were stories out there of collaborations like going awry and things like that. That wasn't our experience at all. I mean, from the very beginning, from the outlining the book through the writing and the editing, I mean, it's been just super easy. And Jack and I are very similar in age, similar families, things like that. We kind of we know the business and whatnot. So it's been an absolute joy. So, and I thank you, Jack, for bringing me in on this.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
My goodness, it's been amazing.
Yeah, totally has.
So as we round this down, please, round of applause for these two gentlemen.